Guess we officially have 5. Should we start or wait a minute or two? Or
yeah, you can start reading the remote meeting script, and then Sundar's here now, so then maybe we'll get some more as they come in.
Okay. As a preliminary matter, this is Curtis Smithson, Zoning Advisory Committee Chair. Permit me to confirm that all members are present and can hear me. Members, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. John? Not present. Ted? Thought I saw him. Elise?
Present.
Ron? No Ron yet?
No Ron.
Sundar Subramanian present.
Madhu? No Madhu. Mary?
Mary Larson Marlowe present.
And Rachel.
Rachel Rawson present.
Okay, so we have John, Ted, and Ron. Haven't checked in yet. I guess staff, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. John Gelsich. Good evening. This open meeting of the Zoning Advisory Committee is being conducted remotely, consistent with the recently signed an act extending certain COVID-19 measures adopted during the state of emergency. This act includes an extension until April 1st, 2022, with the remote meeting provisions of his March 12th, 2020 executive order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law. The new law has 2 major parts. First, the new law allows public bodies to continue providing live, adequate alternative means of public access to the deliberations of the public body instead of holding meetings in a public place that is open and physically accessible to the public. Adequate alternate means may include, without limitation, providing public access through telephone, internet, satellite-enabled audio or video conferencing, or any other technology that enables the public to clearly follow the proceedings of the public body in real time. Second, the new law authorizes all members of a public body to continue participating in meetings remotely. The open meeting law's requirements that a quorum of the body and chair be physically present at the meeting location remain suspended. For this meeting, the Zoning Advisory Committee is convening by video conference via Zoom app, as posted on the town's web meeting calendar and the ZAC agenda identifying how the public may join. Additionally, the meeting may also be broadcast by HCAM through one or more of its channels or platforms. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and that some attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that others may see you, and take care not to screen share your computer. Anything that you broadcast may be captured by the recording. Some ground rules. We are now turning to the first item on the agenda. Before we do so, permit me to cover some ground rules for effective and clear conduct of our business and to ensure accurate meeting minutes. I will introduce each item on the agenda. If members wish to engage in dialogue with other members, please do so through the chair, taking care to identify yourself. Not every agenda item will feature public comment. For items with public comment, after members have spoken, the chair will afford public comment as follows. The chair will first ask members of the public who wish to speak to identify their names and addresses. Once the chair has a list of all public commentators, I will call on each name and afford 3 minutes for any comments. Finally, each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by roll call vote. Okay, Ted's here. And Madhu's made it here. So we're missing Ron and John, I guess. I was hoping Ron was going to be here to present his parking table, but I'm sure we can stumble through it. Let me find the agenda here. The first agenda is a presentation on form-based code overview that John Gelsich is going to present for us.
Okay, so who is familiar with form-based code? Anyone? Oh, Gary.
Only from your mailing.
Okay. So let's get started. Hopefully this doesn't bore you. I will try and go through it relatively quickly, but it is pretty graphic because form-based codes are pretty graphic. So what are form-based codes? They are essentially a type of zoning that regulates building form before building use or structure use. And so that is really the main goal. There's Ron. The main goal is to create a sense of place instead of regulating uses. So they are regulatory, like conventional zoning. They're not advisory, like guidelines. They use certain parameters to guide development, which is in contrast to numerical requirements such as heights and setbacks and that type of stuff, coverage, lot coverage. They can be applied in many different places and scales. You can do downtowns as a form-based code. You can do a certain district. You can do an overlay as a form-based code. It's not usually recommended to do that because you want the form-based code to be the code and not have an underlying code that can alter what you're going for with the form-based code. But you could say, downtown area needs to be done in a form-based code type of thing. They're highly graphic, so they use a lot of images to convey the information rather than words. And what I view form-based codes as is something that really encaptures traditional neighborhood development and traditional downtown New England style development, where these developments that were built prior to zoning, they were built based on what things looked like, what was more practical, and that type of thing. So what do we find to be wrong with conventional zoning? You probably knew this without maybe realizing it, but conventional zoning really is sprouted from the Industrial Revolution. So when the industry that was pumping out soot and smoke was near residences, nobody wanted to live there. So they segregated the uses, right? Prior to the Industrial Revolution, you didn't really have a separation of uses. You had retail with residential and institutions all mixed together because people didn't have cars. They didn't want to walk far for things. So everything was, within walking distance and very clustered. We've been playing catch up since conventional zoning became a thing in the early 1900s because zoning is an archaic strategy. And so when we have an ever-changing development landscape, the zoning is always trying to catch up to what we're proposing now. And we see it with what we're doing all the time. We're constantly amending zoning because it's not satisfying the needs that we have for what it needs to do. So like I said, zoning is usually reactionary, and form-based code is more proactive in terms of development. So what we've gotten from conventional zoning that some may think is okay, but many in the planning world don't think is okay, is large lot sizes, rendering a lot of the lots that we currently have non-conforming. Look at downtown Hopkinton. Most of the downtown Hopkinton lots are non-conforming. Housing affordability not going away anytime soon. We need variances, which is an odd thing if you really think about it. You need to vary the zoning bylaw because what you think would be a good use there doesn't fit with the zoning. So then does the use not work or does the zoning not work for that area? And usually it's the zoning doesn't work for that area. And that's why the variance is granted. We have an infrastructure in America that is over reliant on cars. That's not how it used to be. There used to be trolleys and streetcars all over the place. And that's not how we operate right now. We've had decades-long decreases in small business development, small business economy. You hear this every day. And it's because people have to drive to the certain stores. And so they now have online shopping. So they don't want to do that. And the houses are farther away from this town center. And I'm not saying form-based code is going to solve all these issues, but it could solve some of these issues. And so we also have a decrease in the sense of community. Some planners have called streets traffic sewers because they really just move cars through, not really seeing what's on the side of the road. And you can see that in a lot of places. So why form-based codes? I've said a couple times already, they form a sense of place. And so what a sense of place is When you're standing there, you say, I am in downtown Hopkinton, and it feels like an established place. It's not just a bunch of storefronts and a sidewalk. It has its own feeling. And form-based codes can do that through the type of regulations that you can implement. And I'll show you some images later. And I think if you haven't understood what that description is, you might get it just through the visual images. And so form-based codes really focus on how the buildings relate to the streetscape rather than the use. And so that's where all the form versus use comes in. They're designing, form-based codes aim to design the streetscape rather than regulate the use, thinking that if the streetscape is designed in an appropriate way, the appropriate uses will fill in. If you have certain requirements for the way that the buildings are going to look, you're not going to have an industrial use come in because it's just not going to fit in that building. You're going to have retail, you're going to have restaurants, you're going to have those types of things that are designed for that type of landscape. So build to lines are kind of the counter to setback lines. Setback lines mean you have to set the house back or the building back at least this many feet from the property line. Build to lines mean you have to move the house or the structure up to this line, and it can't be any farther away than that. And you'll see that a lot in downtowns, traditional New England downtowns. They're right up on the sidewalk. Houses, retail, restaurants, that type of thing. And it kind of contributes to the streetscape aspect that I was talking about earlier. Form-based codes do acknowledge that uses change, but when you regulate the form, you don't have to worry about those uses changing as long as the form is appropriate for what you're trying to get out of that streetscape. And so, like I said, plenty of times now, historic development we enjoy. You go to a nice downtown of New England, Portsmouth, Portland, those type of downtowns where everyone seems to like them. Those would be form-based codes essentially, because it goes back to the traditional neighborhood design. So this is what I was talking about with some images. I think you can understand what a sense of place is. So we've got Chatham and Wellesley. Wellesley's not a great picture, but you can see that there is some uniqueness, but it also looks like a downtown. You have these storefronts right up along the street. They're not set back. There's not really any wasted space. You're not going to get industrial uses in there. You're not going to get undesirable uses. You're going to get, well, I should say, maybe you'll get too many banks, but that's not necessarily a reason of form-based code. But you'll get retail, you'll get restaurants, you'll get those types of things. Same thing with Chatham. And I understand these are different types of downtowns. Chatham may be more of a vacation spot, but these types of things are not unique to just vacation areas. And some examples in Maine, you've got Bar Harbor and Camden, where they kind of play off of the colors, but you see a lot of the storefronts looking as designed as you would want a nice, quaint storefront to look. You can have residential in these. You can have restaurants and retail. You can have offices. All these different types of uses can fit into these types of buildings that would all be appropriate for this type of a downtown. Or this type, it doesn't even have to be downtown, this type of a development area. And some outside of the New England area, you have St. Louis, Missouri. This is a residential building. So you've got some townhouses that may have been converted from an old building, but if not, you can even build it like this. And they fit into the downtown streetscape. And going away from the downtown discussion, in Langley, Washington, you have this type of smaller, denser housing that allows for common space in the middle. Rather than having backyards, everyone shares a common space in the middle, and there's alleyways in the back to allow for car travel, to park cars, go to the garage, and that type of thing. So now we're going to get into a little bit more of what form-based codes are. So there's some elements of form-based code. The regulating plan, which is really kind of the main thing. It's the zoning map of sorts. And then there's the table of uses, which is counter to what I'm saying before, but there are some use restrictions within form-based codes. And then the standards that go along with it, and we'll go through all of those, and then the administrative procedures. So the regulating plan, it's a fine-grained zoning map, but it's got more concentrated type of districts rather than broader districts that you'll see on a conventional zoning map. You're not going to have agricultural residential districts like we do all across town. You'll have more focused types of development. And that's if you were to do a large scale form-based code. You can do downtown form-based codes and just have smaller districts, but you might have sub-districts within that smaller downtown district. And these are really kind of the start of all this. This is where the planning happens. You figure out what you want these certain areas to look like, and then you plan the form-based code from that. And the table of uses, similar to what we have in conventional zoning, but it doesn't get really fine-grained. So I can show you the zoning that we currently have in Hopkinton, and this is much more general. You're looking at, if you can see, natural resources are agricultural, aquacultural, district energy system, resource extraction, and utilities and services, right? So it's not getting into the fine-grained type of agricultural uses. It's much more broad. Office, small, medium, and large, and then research laboratory. So you're not regulating what types of offices, just the size of offices or the scope of the type of office. And then you got essentially residential. You don't really get into too much detail with those. You've got dormitory, mobile home park, residence, and residential care facility. So you're not getting into the multifamily, 2-family, 3-family, that type of thing. It's just residence. And you make the buildings designed to fit what you're looking for in there. If you're looking for more 2 families, then you make the regulations for the building form to be more guided towards 2 families than multifamily, large apartment buildings. So you have different kind of frontage types. And one of the quotes that I put in here is that this is really what gets to the heart of what form-based codes are about. It's how the buildings shape the public realm. When you're on a sidewalk and the housing or the buildings are close to you, you feel like you're in a place, you're in a location rather than just a smattering of different types of buildings. You get the streetscape going, benches, trees, that type of stuff, and it contributes to that. Building types, we can go into a lot of detail. So what I'm pulling a lot of these images from is called Place Code. And I forget what the firm that put it together is, but it's essentially an open source form-based code that you can pull from and use to develop a form-based code for your municipality. And they've got all these different types of things laid out in these graphical forms with details about them, architectural components, what the roofs are going to look like, to really design the building rather than design the uses. There's a good cross section of the streetscape. So you have, different zones. So you have parking zone, travel zone, sidewalk zone, planting zone, and you could have a whole bunch of different types of things. Furnishing zones, which are like benches or bike racks and that type of stuff. And so it lays out these cross sections so you can really plan what you want it to look like. Parking is a unique thing with form-based codes because they try and do what planners try and do generally, which is hide the parking behind the building. You want to not take away from the streetscape, so you put the parking behind. When you've got too much parking in front of the building, it requires the building to be set back, and that's why you get shopping centers and that look. You can have street parking because that serves other purposes, namely slowing down traffic and allowing for people to really just stop and go to where they need to go. But for longer trips, you want to have the parking hidden behind. And that way people aren't looking at cars. They're looking at the streetscape. They're looking at the building, which if you're doing a form-based code, you spend a lot of time designing. Public spaces are always important, and that's not any different for form-based codes. And this particular source code or place code that I'm taking graphics from has different types of public spaces. You have a park, a large park, town square, and that type of thing. And it just gives some elements what you would have in those types of open spaces. So for example, for a park, you want to have 15% minimum hardscape. So 15% minimum of sidewalks and 50% max of that. So if you're having sidewalks or whatever else you'd have that is a hardscape that's not planted landscape type stuff. It sets those limits. And if you want more of that, then you just go to a different type of use. You do, maybe a park's not what you're looking for. Maybe a town square is what you're looking for. And then they've got details about the different types of parks. So you got pocket park, town park, and regional park. And so a pocket park is what, 500 square feet minimum, but up to 1 acre. And then, town park is 1 acre up to 6 acres. Landscaping is also very important, especially for the streetscape aspect. So you want to get certain trees, you want to get certain tree shapes, certain tree species, that type of thing to get the look that you're looking for. If you want to have that nice vision of, elm streets, what elm streets used to look like before Dutch elm disease, where they would cross over the street and provide like a canopy. You're not going to get straight up trees for that, right? You're going to want to get canopy style trees. But if you want smaller trees that don't really shade the roadway, then you're going to want these more columnar trees. So the species and shape really matter for that type of thing. And then this is where you can get really fine grained with the architectural standards. I'm not an architect, so I don't know all of these terms, but getting different types of roofs, types of portico versus porch versus balconies, all those types of things, and really, get what you're looking for. If you want these porches with the steps to the side that you see in a lot of urban communities, that's a certain type of architectural design. If you want the steps that go directly out on the sidewalk straight from the door, that's another type of design. If you want roofed, if you don't want roofed, all those different types of things, dormers, gabled roofs, mansard roofs, all those different things can be incorporated into the form-based code depending on what you're looking for. So how does this relate to Hopkinton? It's very unrealistic to think that form-based codes would be applied townwide. They'd be for certain areas, downtown, over by 495, any other places that are really more dense, where you want people to gather, where you want a certain streetscape to be established. You're not going to be doing it on Saddle Hill Road. You're not going to be doing it on those types of areas because it just wouldn't work. Probably would not be appropriate on South Street since it's our industrial area. And you could do it, but that's not really what this is for. People are not going to be gathering there. You can incorporate elements of form-based code into that, but that wouldn't be the focus of it. And then a potential area, we've talked about this for the housing choice legislation that requires the 15 units per acre. This could be potential for that. So what are the next steps if we wanted to do a form-based code? Obviously, we'd have to have a long discussion about what we would want for a form-based code and how it would go, but it is a high level of upfront effort. The system is supposed to work that you design it and then let it go, essentially, with minimal maintenance. If you designed it properly, the development should reflect what you've laid out. You need a dedicated committee to really look into form-based codes, look into the areas, look into the details and what the town would want from that, and then provide a report or other type of analysis to the town to see what we could do. A lot of towns take over consultants for this because there are some specialized consultants. The place code people that made the open source code that I'm showing you images from, they do form-based codes all over the country. Probably expensive, but if that's something we want to do, it might be worth it. You can start them small and then expand. So if you do a downtown area, say you were to do from Cedar Street to the town common, you could do that area. And then if it worked out well, you could extend it past Cedar Street over towards Wood Street. That could be something that can happen. You don't have to start with one area and stick to that. You could always expand it. Yeah, and form-based code, since it would be a zoning change, it would need town meeting approval. So a lot of education before town meeting as well. And these are my sources. I did pull a lot of these things from these types of references, so I don't want to claim credit for them, but there's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of literature, a lot of documentation. If you want to do some more reading, I can definitely pass it along to you. This Planner's Web series is really good. It's, I think, a 4 or 5 part series that goes into detail about what form-based codes are, how they're applied, and what the goals of form-based codes are. Any questions? I should say, what questions do you have?
For the chair?
Yes, yes, Mary.
So John, first of all, has this, I can definitely see where this would work well when a town isn't yet developed. But in situations where there's already buildings everywhere, how would this really be implemented? It would just be for when changes are made to a particular building, or what? How would that work?
Just
Yeah.
to tag along through the chair, John, you had said this would apply to downtown. So my question is exactly the same as Mary, completely built in. So how would you start somewhere in the middle same question.
Yeah, so you'd basically put into place, and then as buildings needed to be reconstructed, they would have to comply with the form-based code. So one example that I've put in my head and thought about is, if you're familiar with Westboro, that's where I live, so I'm very familiar with it. When you get past the train tracks, leaving downtown, going towards Route 9, there's that shopping center on the left. It's got Yummy Mummy, the CrossFit gym, and the Asian restaurant, and then Arturo's. You could put in a form-based code in that area, and it won't take effect now, but eventually, when that shopping center needs to be redeveloped, it could be developed as this type of development, a form-based code type of development, where it would be closer to the street, the parking would be behind, it would meet, you'd have to do all of these architectural elements and stuff like that. So it is tricky in New England downtowns because it's so built up. But it would basically have to be, as things are redeveloped, they would get put into a form-based code type system.
Through the chair.
Yes.
John, can you help me? I know you mentioned it a little bit in the slideshow. What about this would scare developers, and what about this would make developers really happy?
Just typing this up because I got to take minutes still too. So I think what would scare developers is that it's still an unfamiliar type of development scheme. They're not familiar with what they would be allowed to do. There'd be a lot of questions. There'd have to be education associated with it. And the thinking still is, what uses can I put here? It's all use-based. So if somebody were to, a developer were to come in and say, I want to build this type of development, how do I go about it? They would have to look at building form versus the use. So they may opt to build it before they have a tenant, or maybe they have a tenant that they know what the tenant knows what they want it to look like. And so they have to make that goal and that vision fit into what the form-based code is. So that would be something that would make them probably nervous because it's an unknown. I doubt a lot of developers around here have actually built within a form-based code area. But once I think they understand what it is, it's a lot more clear as to what they can do. And there is going to be a lot less regulation associated with what their development would entail. So they wouldn't have to get a special permit for use. If they know that the guidelines or the regulations, not even guidelines, the regulations say, if you're building on this lot, you need to build to the street line. You need to have these types of architectural elements, and it needs to go this type of design. I'm floundering here with an example, but they would know exactly what they can build, and they wouldn't need to get a permit for it other than a building permit, because the whole point of form-based codes is to design up front rather than as they come in. Right. So somebody wouldn't come into the planning board and say, what can I do? How can I take my vision and fit it to what you're looking for? They would know because it would be in the code.
Through the chair.
Yes, and Doug.
So John, are elements of this applicable to any kind of subdivision design, or is that not relevant at all? Do we even have a problem to solve as it relates to subdivision planning or design? And if there are open issues, can form-based FPCs work in that arena?
Yeah, so sorry, just trying to take minutes.
I was going to say, I've worked in form-based code. I just didn't realize that's what it was called.
Yeah.
I actually had some zoning regs from a community in Illinois I used to work in pulled up. It kind of has a hybrid. Can I share my screen? If I'm smart enough to do so.
So while you're sharing that screen, I can try to answer Sundar's question. So you can apply this to subdivisions, right? Because all the elements are still going to be the same. Build 2 lines, architectural elements. You're just prescribing them rather than allowing the developer to determine what they want. The developer can work within the limits that the form-based code prescribes. So their architects may have more guidance, which probably would be fine for them. But there's no reason why this couldn't apply to subdivisions. It would just take an eye towards what you'd be looking for in a subdivision.
Apparently I'm not very good at this.
And it's going to be tricky for Hopkinton because you have such a rural community, right? Where you have a lot of these subdivisions that are not really walkable. So it could be done, but then you're going to have a subdivision that's walkable connected to probably nothing.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Through the chair,
Yes.
Gary Trendle, 31 Chamberlain Street. Apologize to interrupt. I just, on that conversation of subdivisions, I mean, doesn't form-based code kind of contradict the idea of subdivisions as well? And maybe I'm not taking a broad enough interpretation of a subdivision, but subdivision is inherently applying a use of some kind. So the two kind of seem contradictory to each other.
So they could be, but the way that we're looking at subdivisions, right? Subdivisions are within a residential district and they're focused on residential uses. But with a form-based code, that doesn't have to be true. You could build a subdivision and regulate the types of buildings that are in there. And somebody could put an office. Somebody could put a retail storefront, as long as it meets the guidelines and the prescribed criteria that's part of a form-based code. There's nothing saying that, I guess if you have the table of uses and you explicitly prohibit those types of uses from that district, there's nothing saying that you couldn't build a mixed use community as part of a subdivision. We just think of subdivisions as solely residential, but they don't have to be.
Yeah, this is.
Gary. No, you can go. You go ahead, Curtis.
Oh, I was just going to scroll through this. This is the Crystal Lake Unified Development Ordinance in Crystal Lake, Illinois. It's kind of a hybrid. It's got a lot of graphical representations. I think if you had kind of a mixture of traditional zoning and form-based zoning, you could say we want to see, houses pushed up to the front with detached garages behind for, whatever development you're putting together. I was trying to remember there was they call them PUDs out there, planned unit developments, that there was one fairly large development that was done, like John was talking about, all the streets are pushed up, or all the houses are pushed up toward the street. They're built around common areas in some cases. The houses don't even face the streets. They face like little yard or mini parks. And then all the parking is behind and access to the parking is through alleyways. So as you drive through it, it looks a lot like, an old downtown used to be, where all the houses were pushed up to the street because nobody wanted to shovel, all the way back to the back. So I think that's how it could kind of meld with a typical subdivision development too. If you were trying to develop a certain look for an area, you could go back to an older, kind of more of an old-fashioned layout. I haven't looked very closely at this. Most of what I did was commercial in this area, but there's a lot of graphical. We want it to look like this. Tell us how you're going to make it look like this, rather than it's got to be this use or that use. I'm sure it's somewhat restricted. You can't put a oil refinery in the middle of a neighborhood, but I think it gives a little bit more flexibility. But this is not really what I was thinking, but it gives you kind of a graphical representation of what you want things to look like. I think it was their downtown plan that specified we want to see, buildings with steps to the side, dormers, the specific look they want to achieve as new things are built.
So yeah, so having that is similar to a form-based code. You mentioned PUDs earlier. PUDs are kind of like form-based codes, but more prescriptive in a different way. They're really just everything is planned out. So Legacy Farms is a residential PUD essentially. There's a master plan showing how things are going to be laid out. There's guidelines that go along with it, and then things are built in that certain way. A form-based code would be applied similarly. There just wouldn't be a master plan saying this is going here, that's going there. It's saying if you want to build this, it has to look like this, and so forth and so on, rather than, we're putting retail here, residential here. A form-based code would say residential and retail are allowed. This is what residential buildings need to look like, and this is what retail buildings need to look like.
I know some of the downtown area in Crystal Lake specifies retail on the bottom, housing above.
What you were describing at the end of there, it sounded like form-based code, but you just mentioned PUDs at the beginning, which are similar but a little different.
Yeah, they typically will allow a little variation from your typical neighborhood design, and the developer comes in for approval on what they want to build.
Curtis?
Yes, Ted?
John, I will preface, as I often do, I love the pictures you showed me. I would love some of Chatham in Hopkinton, but I'm still trying to understand the whole thing. So one of the benefits, I think you said, is once developers understand this, then it's much easier for them. They don't have to go to ask for variances. They don't have to go to ask for special approval for different things. But isn't it just a different kind of special approval they might be asking? Couldn't they say, and maybe now they're going to the design review board, not zoning board of appeals, but couldn't they say, we want to build a building, but we don't want dormers. Can we get approval for that? Isn't it just a different round of exceptions to the rules that we might be opening up?
Not necessarily, because you have to build it. So the form-based code would lay out the architectural standards in a certain way. And it's more of, if you want to build dormers, this is what they should look like. You don't have to build dormers, but if you wanted to, you could. If you want to put a porch up, this is what we want the porch to look like. If you want to put balconies up, this is what they should look like. But you don't have to do that. The things that you would be required to do are more of the build to lines, the not necessarily facade elements, but more bulk elements. I don't know how else to describe it. And then if I guess if they were responsible for this, the sidewalk and the streetscape, then maybe they would have to design the streetscape in the way that the cross section has been identified, with trees in a certain area, benches in a certain area, and stuff like that. But it gives them options to design how they want it to look that are allowed. So if for some reason the downtown people didn't like dormers at all, they wouldn't be able to do dormers. If they wanted to do dormers, there'd be no path for them to do dormers. So going a little off this topic, back in grad school, I had a professor who said, we don't know how zoning actually works because we've never let it work the way it's written. We've always issued special permits, variances to change what zoning that we've written is supposed to be. This changes that. We've written it this way, and that's how it's going to be. We're giving you options to design how you want it to, but if it's not allowed, then you're not going to do it that way, right? If somebody wants to put a different type of roof on, but all the roofs are mansard and they want to do a gable roof, but that's not allowed, they don't have a path for a variance to allow to do that, right? They would have to build to the prescription that the form-based code set forth.
So through the chair, why don't they have a path? Is it just because it's understood we're changing our zoning, and as part of this, we're giving you options, but you must fit in these options, right? Yeah. Why don't they have a path? Just because we've changed the rules?
So the whole point of form-based codes are to design the area that you want. And if it's determined by this group that is establishing the form-based code and then accepted by town meeting that you don't want dormers in this certain area, then that's the area that was designed, right? And so the town has spoken. I think it works well in New England because the town has to vote. It's not this small group of people saying this is what we want. People can present these things to town, and the town meeting says, no, we don't want that, or yes, we do. Now the town has collectively said, as best they can, we don't want this design element in this area. So there's no path forward because the developer wants it, but nobody else does. So it's prescriptive in that way, where we're giving you options. And I guess you can make it as restrictive as you want, but it would have to pass town meeting. But if you give options to give some sort of design latitude, you're allowing them to design the building as they want it while still conforming to the overall design that was determined to be wanted through the form-based code planning process.
So then as I continue to think through it, let's pretend, and you're not proposing this at all for us to consider, but let's pretend the entire town was form-based code. Then we would have no ZBA at all anymore. There'd be no reason for it. Is that true? And there would be no design review board at all because it's already laid out. These are the rules. These are the options you have. Pick from these options.
Yes, but that's a very caution yes, because Massachusetts at the state level enables zoning, and I don't know how a townwide form-based code would comply with the laws that Massachusetts has set out about variances and special permits and the like. It would also be really tough to allow some uses in a certain way, like solar. If we can't restrict solar, would a form-based code apply to a district that would need to require or need to allow solar, right? How would that work? So I don't know for sure, because there are certain uses that may not really work with form-based codes. And a town-wide application might cause problems with the state regulations. But effectively, hypothetically, yes. If the town was the size of the downtown and we put a form-based code on the downtown, which essentially was coterminous with the boundaries of the town, effectively, you would not need a board of appeals or a design review board because everything would be laid out in the code.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions or comments?
Through the chair.
Yes.
So John, first of all, just a related question. Do you know when the initial zoning was first done in Hopkinton? Decade that it happened.
I want to say the 50s.
Yeah, I thought so. Okay. Okay, good to know. And I agree with the concept that zoning and the zoning changes that we talk about and make are reactionary completely. I also, I remember thinking from the early days of like, Wellesley just has this, beautiful and fairly consistent architecture and look in their town, particularly commercial buildings. And I always thought that was great. And I can understand that, there's, they probably have pretty strict design rules within their zoning, or perhaps form-based zoning, possibly. I don't know. But I think it's a neat idea, and would make a lot of sense for the downtown area. Obviously, as you say in your presentation, it's a long-term process to make this happen, and would absolutely require a huge amount of townwide education and discussion, so that a lot of work didn't go into a no vote at town meeting, So, but I do like the idea of it, and we could make it as restrictive or not restrictive as we would wish through this process of getting there. And yeah, and it also would take a while, even after it was implemented, to have an effect. But it is future looking rather than constantly doing catch up. And yeah, I think that's really good. I was asking about the year that some of the initial zoning was done in town, because I've heard on more than one occasion arguments to the effect of, and this is generally at town meeting and generally opposing some zoning change, to the effect of, well, the initial people who put together the zoning knew what they were doing and we shouldn't mess with it. It's like, and I think that's just fundamentally wrong, because yes, they had very good ideas for some initial zoning, but this is the zoning that we have is a living, breathing type of document, and needs to react to changes in the world and changes in technology and things like that, and changes in the desires of the community members. So, but yeah, thank you very much. This is really interesting. And it's not something that, I feel like Zach is going to take on as a big project just yet, but but it's definitely something to think about for the downtown. And I think that it might have some applicability when we're talking about affordable housing. And I'm not talking about the state programs of affordable housing, but just denser housing that is more in the attainable range of prices for the middle class, and that we could potentially do something in the downtown that was form-based, or at least a hybrid of form-based and some aspects of that. I just love the concept of these denser housing units with common space and common yard in the center. And I think that that's something that we may want to look at in the near future.
I would think it would mostly be applicable to, established older historic areas, rather than some of the new, the whole thought of residential subdivisions has gone to winding sinuous roads with giant lots and houses set way back. Whereas, in the 20s and 30s, when things were laid out, everything was pushed up to the street. You had, breezeways in between the houses. It was a whole different plan. You don't want somebody to come in and tear down a whole block and put up some kind of giant squared off concrete building in the middle of what, you want to look more like a historic neighborhood. So yeah, that's where I think it would probably, the downtown area, Woodville, some of those areas might benefit from something like that.
Through the chair, if we did have a like, let's say we had one set for downtown, would it also require people to maintain the buildings to look nice so they couldn't just sort of be rotting away? Is that part of it?
Not necessarily.
Inspector.
Yeah, not necessarily. The thinking from my perspective, the thinking is if there's businesses downtown that are rotting away, then it's affecting their own business. People are not going to want to go to that nice business. So it's in their interest to keep it maintained. Obviously, that's not always done in practice, but there's only so much you can do to require maintenance.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I think inspectional services would step in where it was a danger of some kind. Yes, Gary? Do you have
Thanks to the chair. I just want to say, number one, thanks to John for giving this overview. And I, to be honest, really agree that our existing use-based zoning causes a lot of problems. I have some questions that I'll save for later, but I just want to throw one other idea out there. I'm wondering if this as a concept might make sense, for example, in the hotel overlay district over by 495 and Elm. And just throw that out there because I think that it's really scary for people to change zoning in an area that they already have, like downtown. And I think that could be really challenging for people to embrace. But as I think about the hotel overlay and a lot of sort of concern about what that might look like or what that might be, that might be a really good place to pilot or try something like this that doesn't have, that doesn't sort of risk a lot of what people already know and love about Hopkinton. So just kind of plant that seed, and I'll stop talking because I could probably talk about this stuff for another few hours.
Okay. Thanks. Any more comments? Should we move on to our next agenda item, which is going to be our parking changes proposed by the Chamber of Commerce. I guess, Ron, do you want to kind of elaborate on what you had brought up before? I know you sent a table to Mary and I forwarded it on to John. I don't know if you want him to pull that up on the screen, or you have it. Good.
So Scott worked to pull together some other towns that had comparable zoning. And can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
So
I can't make out the numbers. I wonder if those can be made a little bigger. It's better. That's even better.
So it just blocks off the summary at the end. But so here on the left-hand side is where we are now. Not every town has comparable categories to what Hopkinton does. And then the bottom is taking the top numbers and averaging them out so that it's all comparable. And I'm going to need to bring it down one click to come back to this. On the far right, the office use and the medical office use, the recommendation is to keep things the same. For the R&D, the life sciences, and the warehouses, we're recommending changes compared to where we are today. And that's really what our focus as a zoning advisory committee is, being on, in the industrial areas, looking at R&D, life sciences. That's really where we want encourage people to grow and come forward. So this is just the same idea, but just giving you the comparability of some of the other towns. That's all I had, Curtis.
Okay. Yeah, I had this afternoon looked at, I think Waltham, Watertown, Newton, and Westboro. Looks like some of those are represented here. Let's see. Yeah, unfortunately to read it, I have to scroll back and forth. So office use right now, we're at 3 per 1,000 feet. Recommendations to keep it there. R&D and industrial, we are presently at 3 also. And your recommendation is to go to 1.25 per 1,000 square feet. I think given, you know, the robotics and everything that are coming in nowadays, that I don't know that that would not be a wise move. Life sciences labs, that I could find, we didn't specifically have a life sciences use. We have R&D, and then some of the industrial classifications, there is a use kind of pertaining to life sciences, but so we're talking about going to 2, so a 33% decrease.
Hey, Curtis,
Yes.
can I ask a question through the chair? These parking requirements that we're thinking about changing, are these the minimum parking requirements, the actual, the maximum? Can you just clarify what we're talking about here?
It's my understanding they're the minimum required.
Yeah.
In my experience, I did a lot of work with developers that did the build it and they will come. So they would look at like worst case scenarios of what use would be in each space and try to maximize. You know, if it exceeded the minimum, then they would build what would be needed to satisfy the clients or the tenants. So these would be minimums, absolute minimums that would have to be met for approval, but there's nothing saying they can't make it as big as they want to.
Okay, thank you.
Then the warehouse, I think we had 1 per 1,000 square feet. Recommendation was go to 0.83, which is a fairly minor change. And medical offices would remain at 3. Is there any discussion of, well, let's see, Ron, can you not or stop sharing and I will attempt to pull up what I want to pull up here. Apparently I did a poor job last time, but we'll see. This gets me to the right thing. I went through and looked at, I guess, what was in that memo before, and looked at what our existing zoning would be for a, you know, just representative 10,000 square foot building. Warehouse would go from 10 spaces required to 8.3 spaces. R&D 30 down to 12.5, or I guess rounded up to 13. Life sciences right now would require 30. This would reduce it to 20, and then offices remain the same. So it is a reduction. To me, there's really no since you're not holding a developer to those numbers, that's just, we're reducing the minimum amount if they're sure they can operate with that reduced number of spaces, then I personally don't see an issue with reducing the minimums somewhat to help bring in some additional. And these were the parking comparisons for surrounding communities. Just a lot of them are based on employee counts, which I think we discussed before that, if the building's sold and it's a different use, then, it may be a different number of employees occupying the space. So I'm not sure if basing it on employee population is the ideal way to go. And I guess if anyone has any comments or recommendations on thoughts.
So if I may.
Good.
So as I was looking at the other spreadsheet and then at this, I know that Waltham doesn't have it divided for life sciences separately, but Waltham, Lexington have a lot of life sciences, and Milford less so, but I'm thinking that even 2 is a little high per 1,000 square feet for life sciences. And I would almost lean toward making it closer to the R&D and industrial uses. Just a thought. Again, thinking along the lines of these are minimums. And I strongly feel that developers, either building on spec or building for a particular client in mind, will build more spaces if they need more spaces. And we're not putting them in a situation, and keeping in mind, this is not as applicable to the downtown area. It's not where we're tight on parking. This is, so we don't want just huge parking lots that aren't being used. We want as few parking spaces as possible. Better for stormwater management, better for the environment, better for the look and aesthetics, having more green space and so on. So I would definitely support even taking life sciences down further to 1.5 or even down to the 1.25 per thousand that the chamber was recommending for R&D and industrial. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't have any objection to that. Like I say, it's been my experience. Developers are going to build what they need. They're not going to underpark. They prefer to build the least they can get away with.
Yeah.
I've worked in some communities that had ridiculously large parking requirements, and then once the building's open and the business are operating, half of the parking lot's empty most of the time. We want to, I guess, kind of avoid that too. Like you say, reduction in impervious area, reduction in construction costs for the developer. There are definite pluses to that. Yeah, and there was some community I was looking at that had rolled life sciences, R&D, and industrial into one specification for parking. As in, most research and development labs are more equipment than people nowadays. So you have a large square footage that doesn't have a whole lot of people occupying it. Huge area may only have 4 people in each corner and the rest of it be full of equipment.
Yep.
So yeah, I would think maybe taking the life sciences back down to either 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 800.
So Curtis, just a procedural question. So if we do come to some kind of a consensus at this forum, does this have to go through a town vote, or what exactly, or would we recommend this to the planning board? What would be steps that we would do?
Gonna defer that to John.
So if this were to, if you were to find different parking minimums than what is currently approved, they would have to be changed in the zoning bylaw, which would require a vote of town meeting. Does that answer your question? Is that what you're looking for?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. That's exactly what I wasn't sure if this was more of a recommendation from Zach to planning board and then on to town meeting, but it's what you basically said is it would have to go, eventually it would have to go to the annual town meeting for a vote, right?
Yes.
Yes, it would be the same process as any other zoning amendment. So Zach,
Got it.
yeah, I would draft up an amendment document saying the things that are going to change. Zach would talk about it and then vote on it and then pass it along to the planning board, who will have a hearing on it.
Okay.
And then take it from there.
Got it.
Through the chair.
Yes, Ted.
So I'll preface this question with, I don't like pavement. I like trees. I like green space. And I'm being convinced pretty easily by why would a builder build more than they need? Why would they build less than they need? With all that, why do we have any parking requirements at all? Why not just say anything you want for a parking lot for these particular types of businesses, which are not in the downtown region, which are not in the shopping center? Why bother have any parking regulations, requirements?
Sounds like a planner question.
Yeah. So developers who are building for a tenant who has employees are going to provide parking for their employees. Builders that are building for a retail establishment or others who are relying on customer access may not build the appropriate amount of parking. You're always going to provide your employees enough parking. Well, I shouldn't say you're always going to. You're going to provide your employees with enough parking if you think that's appropriate. If a developer were to, so say a developer is the employer, right? They're going to build a building for themselves. They would likely build enough parking for their employees unless that is on a public transit route, which I would argue probably don't need as much parking because it's on a public transit route. However, if you have somebody building a restaurant and they could eke out 500 more square feet for that restaurant by getting rid of 2 or 3 spaces, are they going to be bothered as much by customers having to find parking elsewhere? Obviously, you can say, well, if the customers can't find parking, they're not going to go to the restaurant. That's a gamble that they may have to take. So I think parking minimums may not be necessary in a lot of situations. You see that being a trend in the planning world. Some more progressive and forward-thinking cities are getting rid of parking minimums and only doing parking maximums to kind of goose public transit use.
So through the chair, if I could, I get what you're saying with restaurants. And I think that in my time in Zach, we discussed a lot the Starbucks and the mistakes that were made with parking over there. But what we're looking at right now aren't restaurants. I don't think, we're not looking at the list of proposed types of businesses, but I don't think those are customer drive-up businesses, right? Those are employee-only businesses, I think. Unless if it's a warehouse, maybe the trucks that are picking stuff up. I don't really know how that business works. Maybe those are customers to the warehouse. So I ask Zach again, for these businesses, should we have any parking regulation? Because these are not customer-based businesses. And they're not the kind of businesses that show up downtown or by the Starbucks or Hiller's Pizza or those places.
Through the chair.
Yes, Mayor.
Tad, I would support that for the general office, research and development, industrial uses. I would support no parking minimums. I don't necessarily think town meeting is ready for that, but I might be selling them short. So, but I really don't think it's necessary for that.
And to borrow from what John said, progressive thinking towns are moving in that direction. I like the sound of being a progressive thinking town. Does anyone else, Curtis, I know you're the chair, but does anyone else have a thought? Like maybe we should, and again, I don't see in front of me right now the list of businesses, but maybe we should just cut it loose completely and see if that's something that the planning board would be interested in. Is it something we could sell at town meeting? Because that's always part of what we do. I get that, Mary, completely, is we have to be able to sell ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, through the chair, I would be supportive of that. And Ted, to your point, then it becomes more of a common sense thing, because the developer who's doing this has a general idea of, they're not going to not have anything. Then it becomes as needed when they design certain things. So they won't be bound by minimums and maximums. Instead, they would work with whoever is going to be the resident in that place, and then decide what sort of common sense number is, as against being bound by the minimums and maximums. I definitely would be supportive of that.
I think your problem comes in when ownership changes and the next owner needs twice as many parking spaces. If the one guy came in and said, I've got a 10,000 square foot building, but I've only got 2 employees, so I only need 2 spaces. Well, the next one comes in, is going to do manufacturing or, some kind of labor intensive thing. He needs 20 spaces. I think we should at least provide some logical minimum based on typical planning principles, so we don't wind up with that situation. I think that would be the concern.
So through the chair, I'm just trying to explore the whole thing. I'm just trying to figure out what I think by asking questions. And as I like to remind everyone, I'm a high school history teacher. I'm not in real estate. I'm not in a business. I'm barely an adult. But maybe part of it is, if the developer owns the property, then we run into a problem of selling the property. If the developer is leasing the property, the developer might want to give him or herself room to have a new tenant, and they would make a different decision on how they develop parking. If a developer owns the lot, that developer might say, I don't need this much parking, but I want to make some because at some point I want to sell it. In the end, is it our job to figure out what the seller or the renter needs to do? If it doesn't involve downtown, if it doesn't involve the more commercial areas that we're talking about.
Good point.
And I don't know. I'm not trying to say I'm right. I'm just exploring questions.
Yeah, I almost think we need to give them some kind of something to aim at as a bare minimum to make sure that they think about the future, I guess. But
the chair, Curtis?
Yes, Ron.
I'm just wondering, Mary and Sundar, from a planning board perspective, is it helpful to have some minimum guidelines there when you're reviewing a new plan, as opposed to leaving it wide open? Because I don't know. I'm asking that question. I'm not really sure, but it seems that without at least a minimum guideline, you could have a developer come in that's completely off the charts and say, I'm not going to put any parking in. People are going to Uber to work, and that's the way that we want our employees to get here. And that might be a good idea, but it might be an awful idea. And where does the planning board go to say that that's not a good idea?
Through the chair.
Yes.
I think that the planning board doesn't need this right now. They rely on it because I mean, it only comes up for downtown. That's really the only place where we're looking at the number of parking spaces and making sure that they're not trying to come in underneath, the minimum, because we know that the downtown is so hard to find other parking for businesses. But it never comes up with industrial A type of buildings. And I think planning board might use it as a crutch right now just because they're used to seeing it, but I don't think it's necessary. And I think, as old as we are, we could probably learn. We could learn something new about it. Again, I don't necessarily think town meeting, or even, when we sell it to planning board, because we have to get it past planning board first. I don't think that they're quite ready for prime time here. But I think that setting the minimum as low as possible for these particular uses, and I'm excluding, I specifically excluded the medical and dental office when I was listing the different uses. I think that it's general office, R&D, and industrial and life sciences that are the ones that we can say, we can keep the minimums pretty low because the developer or business should know their own needs. And it's primarily for employees. So.
And yeah, the medical and dental is kind of a customer business. So that makes sense.
That's different.
But again, I don't see the list in front of me, so I couldn't remember what our different categories were.
So anyhow, I would definitely support whatever way we decide to go, but I would support keeping those minimums pretty darn low, because I don't think they're going to go with the minimum in an industrial use, because this is really only affecting industrial A and B. Mm-hmm. So.
Through the chair.
Yes.
Is there, I don't remember now, is there a proposal to change the medical and dental, or is the proposal to keep that the same? The chamber's proposal?
Keep it the same.
Okay.
Yeah, I think all the office was staying the same. And then we had discussed dropping the life sciences down to match the R&D and industrial, if we want to proceed with that. I think in talking with John, the next step would be to put together draft revisions to discuss and vote on at the next meeting. And then that would go on to planning board and on to a town meeting warrant. And one thing that we keep discussing life sciences. In searching through our present zoning bylaws, we don't mention life sciences anywhere. Nope. If we're going to put in a parking requirement for life sciences, do we need to define life sciences? We do have several places. All I found was in industrial A, industrial B, with this genetic, biological, chemical research centers, laboratories, manufacturing process plants with the biosafety level of 1 or 2, as a permitted use by right, and a special use for a biosafety level of level 3. Would it make sense to, if we want to refer to life sciences, go back and define that in the definition section of the bylaws and maybe pull some of this verbiage into it? Or do we just change R&D? What I was thinking is split the office and R&D industrial into separate lines. If we went even further and rolled life sciences into the R&D and industrial as laboratories, R&D and industrial, all with the same requirement. I think that would get us away from having to define a life sciences use. Since really it sounds like it's only allowed in industrial, that kind of use is only allowed in the industrial A and industrial B as it is.
That makes sense if we keep the life sciences requirement, the minimum requirement, the same as the R&D and industrial, just to add life sciences to that line without adding it anyplace else. That makes sense to me.
Or if we
warehouse parking requirements, we were also refining. Recommendation, Ron? Because that's a separate line, isn't it?
Yeah, that's in.
Oh, there it is. Okay, yep.
Yeah, it's 1 per 1,000. We talked about going to 1 per 1,200.
Yeah. Okay, good.
So the warehouse use is already separated. If we made a modification, split general office, medical and dental office into a separate heading, kept it at 3 per 1,000, and then added, say, laboratory, R&D, and industrial at the 1 per 800. And, life sciences would be included in the laboratory. I don't know if life sciences needs to be spelled out as an individual use. The research laboratories are defined in the permitted use under industrial. So I think maybe the changes we make are the splitting the office and industrial type uses into two different headings, and then roll laboratory into call it laboratory of R&D and industrial, and all the same requirement of the 1 per 800.
If I may, through the chair.
Yes.
I like the idea of that wording, because what if you had a robotics lab that wanted to come in? That's not technically life sciences at that point, but it's still laboratory, and it would still fit into the same grouping. Just something random to think about.
Okay. So do we want to have John put together a draft of changes reflecting that and vote on that next go around, next meeting?
Through the chair, before could I ask one more question? And maybe Ron, you can help me out, but maybe somebody else can help me out. Is that okay, Curtis?
Suits me.
I wonder, Ron, or anybody, can you help me with understanding how the business of a warehouse works? Here's what I imagine. I imagine that somebody pays to have space to put a bunch of crap in. There are workers there that move the crap around, but the only people that drive up are big trucks to put the crap back in the truck or drop it off, and the workers who work the forklifts. Is that about right?
It certainly is. I'll give you an example of the Boston Athletic Association warehouse off of South Street. It's on Avenue D. And again, they right now it is filled to the roof with stuff for the marathon coming up next Monday. But most of the time, they get deliveries of goods and services, and then periodically they move some stuff out of there. But stuff goes in and out. So it's a very low employee type of a facility, except for outlying events. I mean, right now, there are dozens of people working in the warehouse to get, to move stuff in and out. But that's typically how a typical warehouse is going to work. It's mostly for storage, and stuff is going in and out periodically. A lot of moving and storage companies do the same thing. The companies will rent space in a moving and storage company thing for a period of time, and then it comes in and goes out.
So then, if we were to think, if we had zero parking regulations, the developer or owner would think, Well, there's some times of the year where I have to double the number of employees, so I better provide parking. Or I don't ever want to be a seasonal warehouse. That's not my goal, so I don't need to expand the parking. Is that accurate? Yes. So I'm going to offer again. I don't think that we should, because it doesn't sound like it has enough behind it. But I am leaning towards, after my last week's questions of this seems like a radical change and that scares me, I'm going more radical and I'm saying, let's make it even more permissible. If that means less concrete, if that means more options for businesses in areas where we don't have to worry about customer parking anyway, if we have to have a number, I say stretch it to as permissible as we can be. And it looks like for some of these, and I think the warehouse was one, it's a smaller tweak than we can do.
I certainly wouldn't be opposed to that. I'm not certain that the planning board is going to support that type of a move. And maybe we go to them with, here's a reduction and here's an elimination proposal. How progressive do we want to be as a community?
Yeah. Can we prepare a draft for planning board consideration before we vote to move forward, get their input? Would that make sense?
That's really not the way that they prefer it. They prefer that we vote on it and then they'll consider it. And
Okay.
they may send it back to us, or they may make changes directly before they send it on to town meeting. So they are completely within their rights to make additional changes to whatever we propose.
Okay, so if we feel like we want to reduce it further than what the Chamber of Commerce is recommending, then we may do so.
Yep, we can.
Through the chair, Mary and Sundar, may I ask just your sense? Would it take a lot of convincing for a lot of planning board members to be more permissible than even the chamber is proposing? Or do you think that that would go smoothly?
I think if we talk them through it, I think they'd be amenable to the changes. I do think that they will be wary of town meeting and how much we can convince the voters at town meeting to change. So,
yeah, through the chair, I would definitely agree with that. And I would go back to what Mary had said, that in my experience, other than when a downtown land development comes for consideration, parking spaces has not been a huge factor or a point of contention in these non-downtown planning exercises. So I think the board would be amenable to this, and I think we probably need Ted to come in and give that spiel, because I think it makes sense. I don't mean it in a just in terms of talking through, but it definitely does make sense. And I think alongside, if you set the stage with this is what the Chamber of Commerce had recommended, but here is even more. So I think you could start with that and build that case for not having those even going lower than what the chamber had asked for. I think they would be amenable.
I think I'd go ahead and start with, well, we're considering eliminating it entirely. And we decided instead to have a small minimum. So.
Through the chair, what I like and what I think the selling point is this is an issue where business interests and environmental interests are in harmony, in complete harmony. A business doesn't want to pave more than they need to pave because it costs them more money. Someone worried about the environment doesn't want to pave more than they want to pave because it kills the earth. I feel like that's not a very hard sell if it's presented that way.
Through the chair, if the Chamber of Commerce is anyway making a case for this to happen, meaning if there is, I don't want to stretch this, but if there are economic benefits to doing this, if this is a barrier to attracting more businesses and one barrier goes away, if it is even presented that way, that could also help the case, which I'm sure that's how this whole discussion started.
Yes.
Okay, so if we can get a draft, then we can obviously make, changes pretty quickly if we have additional changes to make after we think about it for another 2 weeks. So.
Through the chair.
Mhm.
Not you, Mary.
Not me. Sorry.
Can I just request I'm blanking on words right now. A draft of what changes are actually being proposed so I can write it up. It's a little tough to follow on the screen and taking minutes. So I just want to make sure I've got everything right. If you could.
Yeah, I can mark up.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Mark up the thing and run it through. Are we okay with the numbers shown here? The 1 per 1,200 on the warehouse, which I think is what Chamber of Commerce had recommended.
Through the chair.
We want to make that
You
more.
have a number, I'd say 1 per 2,000.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking.
Go
Is
ahead and double it, triple
on
it.
a 10,000 square foot warehouse, that's 10 parking spaces. Typically you're going to have a couple of people loading, a couple of forklift drivers. To me, 10 would be appropriate. If it's, higher employee counts, then they can always exceed that number. So we'll go with warehouse 1 per 2,000.
Here.
Okay. And then we're going to keep office and medical office, or general office and medical and dental office, split that into a separate category, divide out research and development industrial uses, and add laboratories to that, and put that at 1 per 800. I think that's basically what we're proposing. So I can mark that up and send it to John if he can put together the proper form of, or edit it, and we can talk about it again at the next meeting. Does that sound like we need to vote on anything at this point, or just say we'll move forward and take it up for a vote next time around?
Next time.
Okay.
Good.
Does that close out our parking revision discussions? Few things in going through the zoning regs wanted to bring up for future consideration. I know we can't add anything to the agenda at this point. Is there any way we can maybe index or page number our regulations where they're a little easier to follow? I could go in and search on life sciences or industrial, and it would take me to that next word, but then I had to go back to the table of contents or scroll back to figure out what section I was in. I don't know if that's just an administrative secretarial thing to reformat them to where they have a page number and maybe a section number reference also. Just food for thought. And another thing I would like to consider, I don't know if I haven't found it or it doesn't exist, is put together a use table. See if I can find this too. Got entirely too many things open.
It is something that we have been discussing, Curtis. The tables that you're talking about that would overlay, not changing any zoning, but
Right.
just explaining it in a tabular
Basically,
format.
Something like this. Just you have all your districts along the top, spell out your use, have a permitted, special permit, limited, temporary, just some kind of designation. And then maybe, you can't see me pointing, but maybe reference to whatever section, would be applicable. Something like that. To me, if a developer's coming into town thinking, I want to build a McDonald's, can I, what areas of town can I look in without having to go through each commercial section and figure out whether that'll work or not. It could be an appendix or, just another section of use table. I think it wouldn't be that hard to put together. We don't have as many uses as, say, this, I think this was back to Crystal Lake again. They have a dozen pages of spelled out individual, much more specific uses than what we do here. But something that kind of gave you a matrix of, I'm thinking about a restaurant in a agricultural area. You can go to the table, figure out, nope, I can't do it. So that might be something to put on a future agenda also. We'll add that to our work plan, I guess, if that sounds like something that others would think would be a good idea.
Through the chair.
Yes.
I can draft a use table. It'll take a little bit of time, but I think I can put it together. I also have already drafted for my own reference internally a zoning dimensional table that I can present to the board to see if that would be something we want to include in the bylaw. And then I've also got, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, Curtis, I've got 2 draft housekeeping changes that I'll add to an agenda. One of them is to prohibit multiple principal uses on a single lot unless otherwise provided for, because we, for some reason, don't have that in our zoning, which is a pretty common restriction. And a housekeeping item, getting rid of the plural uses in the use listings. So single family, it's kind of tied to the other amendment, but in the uses, we have single family dwellings, plural, which implies that you can do multiple single family dwellings on a lot in a district, or multiple laboratories on a district. So, and not all of them, it's not consistent. Some of the uses are listed as singular, some of them are listed as plural. So it would just be changing all of them to singular. So that's drafted. I will put that on the agenda, and I'll probably add that to the next agenda because we have the public forum. So if I can get the use table completed by then, I can also add that to the agenda.
Okay. So at the next meeting, we'll have our forum. We'll do the finalization and vote on the parking changes, and then we can look at the use table, discuss that, or I guess if it's ready to go, we could send that on the planning board too. That would have to be since it's a modification of the zoning bylaws, it would have to go to town meeting also. But it's basically just a representation of what's in the regs now. I guess that would be the same with the dimensional requirements all being in a table of some kind. And that was another thing that I kind of was looking for when going through the regs or the bylaws was that.
Through the chair, I had a question for John. John, I was under the impression that even if you as much as touch or add a comma or a period or indent the bylaw document, it had to still go through town meeting, but you seem to suggest a bunch of changes. Are you stating that these would actually have to go through? Okay, so as much as we are making these things, they would still have to go to a town meeting vote. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. To get rid of the S at the end of a use would have to go to town meeting.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So I try to clump them all together so we only have to do it once.
And usually those go with no discussion. If somebody says it's housekeeping, nobody wants to talk about it and they just trust it.
Oh, so interesting. So the entire document could be taken up for consideration from an indentation and housekeeping perspective, and that would be a single line item at the town meeting?
It would be a single warrant article. but
Oh,
you
okay,
have
sorry.
to
That's what I
identify
meant to
every
say,
change that you're proposing. So like for this, you'll see it, this plural issue. I've gone through and copied all of the listings of the uses for each district and say, propose to make the following changes, and just like strike out the S's, strike out the IES's,
Okay.
that kind of a thing. Very tedious, but makes it a little bit cleaner.
Yeah, you don't want to give a land use attorney anything to chew on that they can run circles around you. They've been the bane of my existence in the past. So. Are we good to entertain a motion to close the meeting?
Would you like to vote on the minutes?
Oh, yes. The 9/20/21, is that the meeting? I don't have them open in front of me. I personally didn't have any comments or changes. Anybody else?
Nope.
Nope. Okay, I'll entertain a motion to approve the meeting minutes of September 20.
So moved. Mary Larson Marlowe.
Seconded, Sundar.
Okay. Vote, Mary.
Mary Larson Marlowe, yes.
Ted.
Ted, yes.
Madhu.
Yes.
Sundar.
Sundar Shivaraman, yes.
Rachel.
Yes.
Ron.
Ron Foisey, yes.
And Elise.
Yes.
Okay, looks like it's unanimous. Now I'll entertain a.
Curtis, you should state your vote too.
Okay, I vote yes. I am still included. Okay, I guess I'll entertain a motion to close tonight's meeting.
Mary Larson
Sundar
Marlowe. So
Shivaraman.
moved.
Okay, Sundar seconded.
Hey, Jeff.
Okay, take a vote, Mary.
Mary Larson Marlowe, yes.
Ted.
Barker Hook, aye.
Madhu, yes.
Sundar.
Sundar Shivaraman, yes.
Rachel.
Rachel, yes.
Ron.
Ron, yes.
Elise.
Yes.
Curtis is an aye. Okay, this wasn't the train wreck I expected it to be, so.
Very good first meeting.
Way to go, Curtis.
Our next